Okay, I know that there are two groups of people, and basically that's it. And the rest of the world is not digitized yet. And when we mean not digitized, we cannot manage our ownership rights via cryptographic key, as simple as we do it with Bitcoin. And actually, Bitcoin is quite complicated system because it's permissionless and censorship resistant. And the rest of the world should be much easier because you have identity, you have some kind of trust, but still it's not digitized. So the main question of the panel is how all of the assets in the world can be digitized. It doesn't really matter which standards for now, just like at least they should be fully digital. So this huge panel, the biggest I've ever seen, has a variety of expertise because we have people from security, from trading, from infrastructure providers, architects, and consultants, and I'm a cryptographer. And our goal is to come up with some approaches of how we can transform the world. I will give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself. Just quickly, because anyway, it's a very small audience. People know each other already. But yeah, please, Ramya first.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Pavel, for inviting me to this panel. My name is Sri Venkataraman, and I'm a consultant by profession, consulted for Wall Street banks over the last, I guess, 14 plus years. So I know the problem statement of the banks really well in trading and investment banking, and trying to find ways to find use cases using distributed ledger technology for the past several years now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dmitry Cherov. I'm also a cryptographer, and I work for Simix. We are exchange based in Vegas, Nevada. We are a US public company on the OTC market, and we are focusing on securitizing some of the digital assets, starting from securities and commodities.
Your past experience is wargaming, yeah, right?
Oh yeah, I'm from the video gaming.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Carey. I'm the co-founder of blockchain.com. I was the author of something called The Future is Decentralized. I'm the founding commissioner of the Blockchain Commission for Sustainable Development, and do work with the United Nations on that. And I also started a nonprofit or charity called skiesthelimit.org, just focused on helping young adults start their first businesses. So looking forward to being back here. The last time I was in Ukraine, I was telling Tony and Pavel, it was right after the civil war in 2014, and we're taking a plane from Lviv to Dnipropetrovsk, and they did this crazy corkscrew landing, and they didn't warn us when they did it, and so I was much happier with the flight in today. But anyway, I absolutely love Ukraine, and there's so many incredible crypto projects and enthusiasts here, and I'm really looking forward to visiting with everyone, and would welcome individual conversations at any point over the next day or so. So thank you.
You remember Nicholas was doing a podcast with private bank, our private bank. So I don't know how it happened, but
then something terrible happened. 2 weeks later, they got privatized.
It's fine. You should go to the next bank then.
Hi everyone, my name is Ton Weiss. I come from the traditional Wall Street environment, worked for Bear Stearns, then JP Morgan, then a few other companies. Quit that in 2015. I already was involved in Bitcoin as of 2013. Quit to be a trader. Now not much time for trading, travel the world, speak at conferences, run a YouTube channel, educate people on how to trade, and you can catch me on YouTube. And in Russian, you can catch me on the 4 O'Clock channel once every couple of weeks in Russian.
Hi everybody, my name is Hartej Sani. I am the co-founder of both Hosho, which we're known to audit smart contracts. We've audited a lot of smart contracts in this space. And I'm also the co-founder of Zokyo Labs. We are based in between Kiev and LA. We do mostly machine learning development with security in mind, end-to-end. And yeah, I'm based in between Kiev and LA.
You're getting Ukrainian passport, I guess, now.
I'm working on it. I'm going to run for office here. So my son was born in Kiev 6 weeks ago. So I have a half Punjabi American Kozak kid.
Okay, so the first question would be, since we're talking about digitization of assets, is how would you explain in a simple words, shortly, what digitization is to people with whom you are working? It's a hard question.
Thank you. I would think of it as digitization of assets that are not traditionally, traded in, let's say, a stock market. Think of like an art collection, or a, wine collection, or think of it like a luxury goods, or think of it like in my own. I mean, I got a personal experience in dealing with this stuff. The IP assets, whether it could be patents, whether it could be process patents, or whether it could be supply chain certifications, and so on and so forth. It's more about that, giving access to investors, the small investors, the ability to trade in those assets.
What does it mean? Like when you say let's digitize assets to somebody, like
I
what
mean,
does it mean?
So think of it like trading in or buying or or having a huge real estate in the middle of New York City and giving access to the citizens of, let's say, Ukraine, the ability to buy a piece of that, not the entire one. So it's almost like democratization of the investment in real estate.
So we are focusing so far on the securities, mostly on the, let's say, on the private companies, and it's more about like a new technological ways that will be cheaper. Because in past you can do like when you go like public, you can do like IPO, underwriter, investment banking, or pipe. But now you can do this tokenization, and then you can create secondary liquidity on the early stage. Because you see, in some of the countries like in US, like people cannot invest in the early stage company. It means that like all the gains that people can do only when the company is public. But then it's more in the future when we create liquidity for the like some non-traditional asset. It means that we can allow people to participate in the investment from the beginning and have like a gain from the beginning, the same chances as investment banker are doing like on the late stage. So it's more about like to provide, let's say, technological level, and also it's more about like Gordon about the legal stuff, and yeah, it's more about how to connect the stuff that we have right now with depositaries, because all the settlements, an example in US, it's more about like for securities, it's like DCCC, depositary, we can't avoid this. And there are other way, I know like in Europe, people are trying to be certified as new depositaries so that securities can be issued on this like new platform.
Okay, the short answer.
I'm not. Might take this in a slightly different direction. I think the question was like, how do you explain the digitization of assets? And I think we have a lot of work to do, really, to explain that to consumers who find these things probably exotic or scary or confusing, primarily because a lot of the vocabulary that's used in our industry is not very consumer friendly. And there are a lot of technophobes in the world, and we still have a much better job to do in education there. So I try and be quite simple when I explain this to people because for example, like my family members that don't understand finance but have watched and seen many articles about how there's volatility in the crypto markets are very interested in what I'm doing, but still reluctant maybe to place some of their own capital at risk, whether it is in purchasing Bitcoin or other things. Then I sort of explain to them how they put their money into things they find valuable that have digital properties all the time, whether that's listening to music or downloading movies on Amazon or whatever. So you have to explain that digital things that have specific properties can inherit extra types of value. So we need our money to be digital. We need our money to be counterfeit resistant. We need our money to be fungible. And then we want to be able to use that money over the internet so that we can perform commerce with one another. And if we can get to that point, then we can also start to explain how other types of assets could benefit from digitization. And we're actually getting and seeing some traction here. So for a real world example, at blockchain.com, we just passed having 40 million users sign up, and we've had 6 million sign up in the past 3 months alone. It's the fastest rate of growth we've ever seen in the company's history. We also launched a new product or feature this year to allow any one of the users in the blockchain wallet to get exposure to digital dollars. So we've partnered with Pax, which is a stable coin, and right now that is our most popular alternative asset outside of Bitcoin. And that's really interesting. People are seeing the benefits of using digital goods and digital assets, and there's demand for it in the market. Now, we're still early on, but I'm really bullish about this. And in some of our surveying, which I'll talk about a little bit later, if there's an opportunity, there's a very big market for other types of digital assets. And so for people that are working on those projects, I think you are on something very, very good. And there is a market, and it's going to be really, really big.
All right, I will try to make it quick. So when we talk about digital assets, I mean, it's great, right? I mean, the world should be more digital. We should walk away from paper and go more digital. But the question that's really underlying it Is it a digital asset that has a physical form, or is it a digital asset that doesn't take on a physical form? If it's a digital asset that takes on a physical form, then a blockchain is really irrelevant because that asset could still be confiscated and that asset will still, like some government entity will decide whether you own that asset or not, or whether they can confiscate it or whether they can tax it. So like people talk about real estate on the blockchain. That makes no sense. Real estate is a physical form. It's always at risk of confiscation. Doesn't make sense to be on a blockchain at all. Just have it in a database. Now, if we move this to only assets that only appear in digital form, again, a blockchain has certain properties. Now, medical records is a common one. Sure, medical records could only take on a digital form, but then the blockchain takes on the property of if you are not careful with your own medical records, you've just lost all of them, right? You can accidentally delete them, you can accidentally send them to a burned address, or pictures, again, only takes on digital form. But is a picture of a picture as good as a picture? Most of the time, it actually is, right? Like if you have a naked picture floating out there somewhere, right? It doesn't matter if it's an original. If someone takes a picture of that picture, it's pretty much the same thing. So once again, it comes down to the only use case being Bitcoin is the only thing that needs decentralization, and everything else is probably better off as a distributed database, which to me is not a blockchain.
Hopefully now it's time chain.
I mean,
So
the
you
only
don't
thing I
need
would add to this is that, so $15 trillion is about how many assets are traded by paper a year. That's how much is traded by paper each year. And all B2C assets are traded only via credit card today. The B2B market is completely wide open. And there's certain assets today that are physical that have a number. And so it's easier to approach serial numbers. Your cell phone has a number. There's numbers in the physical world, but it's not as easy for things like salt or water. And you'd have to apply a digital passport per se to this physical item, salt. And at least Vinay Gupta from Ethereum was somebody that's been tackling this problem for quite some time. And I think Vinay Gupta worded something interesting to me that I'll share, which was, he didn't word it to me, he worded it to everybody at DEF CON. It's just, I was listening, so it was for me. And he said that lawyers are essentially engineers, it's just they haven't gotten the code yet. They haven't started coding and
Will not.
Yeah.
Speak for yourself.
And
I'm the lawyer.
vice versa. And he said that, he became a lawyer, or started working with lawyers, and he's a nerdy engineer, and finding that balance is really where it's at. And he leverages Ricardian contracts for this.
It's like life balance, yeah?
Yeah. And I think Ricardian contracts via smart contracts are just a key part about this discussion of digitization of assets. Is how he leverages Ricardian contracts and smart contracts to enable it so that a lawyer's actual contract in verbal English words or any language's words are now converted to code. So that's my 2 cents.
I think the audience has noticed that the answers of what digitization is are quite like long, not very, a little bit vague sometimes, and even the word digitization is like hard to pronounce. Maybe that's the problem. Like Bitcoin is easy to pronounce, right? Basically what we see now, the world is full of papers, and we got used that ownership is represented by paper. It doesn't really matter for now whether the property can be seized or like whatever happened to burned, but the ownership right is still an ownership right. And now they are papers, and we need to switch to digits, right? And then these digits should be managed not with handwritten signature, but with digital signature. And I think everybody has have seen DocuSign, all these apps. How do you sign them? You log in with your email, then you see the paper on the screen. Then you see a signature, and they produce for you some drawings that you have no connection to it at all. And it's called digital signature. Obviously, it's not digital signature. The real digital signature we know is cryptographic digital signature. And all assets and all decisions have to be signed in a new form. And what we see with data right now is that we don't have any trust to data that we see because we cannot verify that somebody did the action because there is no proof. And we need to build a system where data has a proof attached to it. So that was my question. How do we explain to people what needs to be done in order to receive proof to an assets or to actions that have happened with an asset? So, okay, that was long story again. So how do you see the process of conversion from the handwritten whatever actions on paper to a digital process? Maybe each from your experience and from your angle of interest, what should we do?
Well, again, I'm going to challenge, what is ownership, right? Like I own my Bitcoin, that's it, because they're only in digital form. The government confirms that I own my car. The government confirms that I own my real estate, right? And if those documents are going to be cryptographically signed, then the government that decides if you own that car, the government that decides if you own that real estate, they just have to approve the fact that a cryptographic signature is better than the current model, which is either handwritten or the email thing that you described. And the government's okay with it until it's time for them to upgrade their database or something goes horribly wrong. And that's not going to make that much of a material difference, to be honest with you. I mean, it'll be better, it'll be less paperwork, but it's not going to make that big of a difference. I mean, look, we're still printing books, right? It's not going to make that much of a difference.
It's for geeks, yeah. So. Geeks like paper. Yeah, but again, my question is, we can, for this discussion, we can take government outside of the scope. Why? Because it's like a risk. You have a risk of losing your key. You have a risk of the fire and destroying your Bitcoin wallet. So these are risks. But the management of the ownership is it's the process of the management. Currently it's paper-based, and we have to make it digital.
Yeah, but there's another bigger risk, right? I mean, if you make it digital on the wrong blockchain that implodes, that's a bigger risk, right? So I didn't say blockchain. I would rather sign like 1,800 documents for my deed than have it in Ethereum, because I think that's a lot more risk by having it in Ethereum than the time that it takes me to sign a stack this big. The risk is less. To me, everybody's different.
But how it's related to the blockchain itself? Because ownership right is more about to approve that one actor signed this, and it should be like KYC of the person related to digital signature. And one Pavel said about on his topic, it can be distributed private key infrastructure. It's not about blockchain itself. It can be without the blockchain. It's more
I agree.
Once we sign, it should be stored somewhere, and then there should be some registry, and then there can be proof. The same with when we have settlement in some depositories. It's more, there is central registry, so far it's central. But it can be decentral. If it will be some nodes, blockchain, proof, it doesn't mean. But there should be some registry where everybody agree that this will be the proof.
Yeah, I agree. Estonia is, closest to doing this, and maybe some other countries are as well. I mean, it's great, it's a huge improvement, but it's not like a revolutionary change to how currently things are done.
Okay, you see, again, a short note that even on this panel, we have disagreement about whether digitization is actually helpful, right? So whether old way of using papers could be more secure from the perspective of the person than using some digital system that may not be proven its security or performance or whatever. So I think that's an issue also. And we as engineers and lawyers should think how it should be improved, the user experience and security. Any other comments? Maybe.
I think there's a really interesting project right now, and I need to spend more time researching it, but Microsoft is working on a digital identity system that uses the Bitcoin blockchain's hash power to secure it. And ultimately, a lot of this is related to you being able to prove who you are and share your public key with someone and have that attestation happen through your social network or maybe through accrediting entities. Now, that'll be annoying for certain things like maybe paying taxes, but this will be a necessary sort of transition. The digital comfort that people will need to go through before we have a much more fluid, financially sovereign world is going to be incremental. And
I'm excited about that project because it's going to be using the most powerful blockchain in the world with the greatest amount of engineering talent building and innovating on it. And I think that's a really strong signal. Like that project has legs, and there's a really good team in Seattle that's focused on that. Digital identity is one of the kind of holy grails of this whole concept. If you have the ability to prove who you are, and it's not decreed by some state, then that is really quite interesting. But then maybe sometimes it will need to be because some governments are still going to require that. Longer term, I think Europe's in a really interesting place to pioneer passporting of digital identity. Of course, that will be tumultuous, especially with the Brexit going on right now. But there is some interesting work happening in that.
Okay, so here we're touching the question of digital identity. This was on my list as well. So obviously you can't really digitize anything until you have digital identity. We do have public key infrastructures right now. Microsoft has built-in infrastructure, and like even in Ukraine we have 17 ones for each ministry. For the biggest banks run them, private bank as well, and you can get your certificate in a second if you have an account in a bank, and then you can sign your tax reports or so. And but there are a couple of issues. First of all, obviously, is registration, then interoperability between the centers, and the last one, I think, it's that the whole concept of certificate is from the paper world, right? Because it assumes it's something like stable. You received it, and you keep it, and you verify it offline. But online and digitization assumes that we don't need to have certificates. We should have a real-time access to some identity storage, time chain. It should be like something like that, which stores all the events associated with a particular identity. And that again represents a problem, like who should be involved in this infrastructure? What kind of players, organizations, whom should we trust? So any comments on this topic? How would you address digital identity? Hartesh.
I think digital identity is going to be very, very challenging because the state kind of decides your identity. And I know there are people that don't have an identity, they migrate, they've never had identity. But how does a first world country trust that identity? For example, if digital decentralized identity was starting to take hold, my kids, the moment that they're born, they'll have like 5 or 6 different online profiles creating them an identity, right? And they'll be different. And then they can, choose one when they're older. Because this is totally corruptible, very, very easily. It's I just don't see it happening anytime soon. Yes, I mean, the world going more digital is great. It makes things a lot easier. Like, it would be great if you can vote, from your phone with your cryptographic signature. So you don't have to, go anywhere, go to the polling booth, and have to, debate whether, they forged the ballot. I mean, these things are great, but do they require decentralization, a blockchain, or not? And I think that's the real question. And the companies that are pitching these things, what's their motivation? Are they printing their own money in order to, justify their jobs? And that's what kind of bothers me, right? Like there are projects that are trying to do this, and then there are projects that are printing their own money trying to do this, and they obviously have an advantage. So we'll see what the regulation says about that. Going digital is great, but I think the real question is what needs to be on a time chain like Bitcoin, and what shouldn't be decentralized at all and just needs to be more efficient. And if you focus on more efficiency, you'd probably get it done 100 times faster and more efficient.
Yeah, you touched like 2 points for efficiency and like transparency and trust. But basically, we're now using identity issued by state, and it lets you get into some countries, right? Receive loans and maybe like other assets. So now it's paper-based, all these passports, etc. And switching to digital seems to be a natural step, but it's not happening quickly, right? You still have all these papers in all countries, and US is probably the one that has the most papers in the world.
Yeah, and the other problem is, I mean, like global connectivity is still terrible. Like half the world still barely gets internet. I mean, even driving through half of the U.S., you're not going to have internet on your cell phone. So a lot of even first world countries still have internet issues. Like that problem needs to be solved.
Yeah, I mean,
Very slowly.
I would probably agree with the assessment that Tony was saying in terms of there is still a lot of, outside of these conferences, there's a big assumption that I'm making here, but most of the users or the common people are technophobes. They don't really understand the technology behind the whole, cryptography. All these are new words, blockchain or distributed ledger. These are all brand new words. And even if you want to get them a digital identity, it'll still take a long, long time before it can happen. As a very layman consumer who can identify with all of these new technologies.
So they all should die before.
No, I'm not. That's not what I mean. But there should be more awareness, and there should be more of the education that we got to do as a community before we can say this thing will happen in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years.
You have a question?
Yeah, I just have one question. I think there's a lot of confusion between two things. One thing, I'm it's for the recording. So I think there's a confusion between two things. The first thing is whether or not the world should go digital. And I think the clear answer is absolutely yes, right? There's a reason why the world isn't going digital, and that is probably political. Because if everyone goes digital, banks would have to fire 90% of their people, governments would have to fire 90% of the people. No one wants to do that, right? So I think that's why it's very clear why you still have real dollars and not digital dollars. But I think it's also clear in the same way that the world is going that way. The other thing that you guys have been talking about all day is the issue of decentralized, yes or no, which is a completely different issue. So I know from 2008, people were talking about the fact that governments would confiscate your money, your cars, your this and that. And to be honest, nothing really happened, and nothing will happen. Yeah, well, but I'm saying, generally speaking, I mean, shit happens, and it will happen. But generally speaking, I don't think that anyone in a modern country is concerned that one day, except maybe if you're living in Vietnam, that one day someone's going to go into your bank account and eliminate your money. And even if that does happen, then that's not something which should control the discussion. So I think there are two separate discussions that you're having. Same when you're talking about digitizing certain assets and how do you trade your art collection or how do you trade anything else. But I think they're two separate discussions, and that's why I think the answers are completely different.
Yeah, we're talking also about automation, basically, underlined. But you can't automate things that are on paper.
You turn them to digital.
So, yes, first digital, then as soon as it's digital, you can decentralize that, the automation.
Let me just, it's not really a question, I'm just going to talk. I think that there's, and I've seen this at other places, there's different concepts that people tend to overlap. There's ownership, which is 100% a legal concept all the time, no exceptions. Then there's control over something, and then there's possession of something. And I can hear, like, as a subcontext during the earlier part of the conversation, that those ideas were clashing because they weren't fully surfaced. Possession is not necessarily ownership, and ownership is ultimately a function of courts and law and contracts. There's also a difference between transfers of property that you need government approval for and that you don't need government approval for. So if you transfer a car in the US, you need to get the DMV to sign off on it before that transfer is complete, or real estate. If I'm gonna transfer a cup of coffee, I don't need to do that. So you gotta keep, I would suggest keeping those silos separate when you're considering digitization and what's involved. Yes, when you need a government quote-unquote oracle to approve a transfer of property, then, you know, I was just talking over there, you know, real estate can't be fully digitized in the US because you need to record a deed before it gets transferred. You need enabling law. But when you have one-on-one contractual relationships that don't require the government, that's an opening for digitization. So Tone, I know I'm setting you up here, but let me just point out one thing to you. And I love all your work, and you and I talk a lot and all that other stuff, but I just want to be clear. just because it's like your private keys. You may have private keys. Someone may steal those private keys. They may have control over your Bitcoin, but they don't legally own your Bitcoin. Right? Just a final point. There's also practical, there's legal and then there's practical. The moment you lose control of your Bitcoin, you may have legal ownership of them still, but you have a real serious problem. So there's operational security versus legal security. So you gotta, from my point of view, you need to tease those out.
Yeah, I know, and I was the one that was trying to separate all these things, but there's just too many to separate. So I try to separate as much as I can. Yeah, you should talk to David Silver about that, who illegally owns all of Crypt's Bitcoin, but he has to go and find Big Vern somewhere in China, and then force the private key out of him. But the one thing I would disagree on is the concern that the government will go into your bank account and take your money is probably the biggest use case that got Bitcoin to where it is today. Because of events like Cyprus, because of events like India canceling their bills, kind of waiting for the euro to break up back into its components of individual countries. Brexit just happened. What happens when a country on the euro leaves? A lot of its citizens will probably turn those euros into Bitcoin instead of turning those euros into their own common currency, into the currency of their actual country, because they're going to be more concerned. I think that is a serious concern, and that goes into the Bitcoin side of it, is that whoever owns that private key will spend that Bitcoin, and that's where the big separation is. But yeah, no, I agree with everything Gordon said.
Yeah, and ownership of the right, you see, we speak about different assets. If you have asset that has collateral, then ownership is on the legal space and it's based on some government. But you're speaking about like...
Right. But even without government approval, like you said about the car and the real estate, like if I'm selling my bicycle, I don't need government approval to hand over that bicycle. But the bicycle still has a physical form. Doing that in a decentralized blockchain is not going to give me, in a smart contract, is not going to give me any more efficiency than doing it over email.
It might allow some standardization and certainty, though that's not the complete solution. Like if everyone agrees that title to bicycles is now something made on the blockchain, that's a standardization that we don't have now. So right now it's like, well, you have transfer because I gave it to you, because you paid me, because we have a receipt, because we built sell. But there's zero agreement in the world about how you transfer a bicycle. If you do have a bicycle blockchain, and this is, by law, this is the way to do it, and it's the only way to do it, then you have a potential efficiency.
Yeah, but that would be like a really inefficient blockchain. Like that's the thing. Unless you somehow create like a contract on the Bitcoin blockchain and everyone uses that standardization. But like how many things in the world are actually standardized? I mean, at least we're finally getting USB-Cs. I hope Apple still needs to, get it together on their phones.
It's like
You get to know about standards. Maybe America is...
But it's not global, right? I mean, it might be standardized
Even
within
in Poland,
Germany,
yeah?
but how do you make it global?
Yeah, but Germany exchange, it's also the law.
Using blockchain, by the way, Tom.
physically.
Create standards, and then push them out.
Yeah, but everyone is pushing their own blockchains instead, right? Like no one wants to, standardize something on the Bitcoin blockchain. Everyone wants their blockchain to succeed so they can get rich on their money.
That's because people still have their mind in maximizing profit instead of building...
Instead of efficiency, correct, which is why you're building all these blockchains. You want to maximize profit, not maximize efficiency.
I'm not building
Germany is known for standards, like das ist fantastisch is like a sign, yeah. I have like two short comments. And the first is the government. When we're talking about even blockchain, the example of the DAO was a governance issue. It's just not this one. Okay, even it wasn't the government who decided, but one person who decided to rewrite the history and to seize certain assets that were kind of approved by the code. And the second thing is that I was provided with a good example of standardization. And actually the containers that we see in the port were invented like 40 or 50 years ago. They were standardized very recently. And only since then you could build a really global network of trade, because now container is the same for you place it on top of the truck or the car or the this vessel, and you can easily move them. And IP protocol is also the same thing. It's a standard for moving data. Doesn't matter which data. So for moving digital ownership rights, there should be a standard as well, according to this logic. But that's another story. You had a
But how?
how what?
I mean, you have.
You moderated the book. You
Of
should
course,
know.
That is why. That is why I'm very well informed. So, bottom line is, you have very different accounting systems that stems from very different commodities.
But it's still
And,
numbers.
Yeah.
It's still accounts, numbers, and transactions. The transactions are moving balances between accounts. It doesn't matter which asset is behind.
Okay,
Whether
but
it's
still, who is enabling the moving from one account to another account?
an owner using digital signature. No?
But then the moment we are entering anything that's paper-based, anything that's legally compliant, where regulation kicks in, the specific accounting system handling that specific asset has to be able to be.
So we try to do this with all the different exchanges across the world have, in some cases, tried to be able to operate amongst each other. We tried to do it in South America. There were 30 or so different exchanges, but they had their own individual operating systems and they couldn't technologically connect the systems. It became a nightmare to try to connect all the systems. The idea here is creating a regulatory protocol amongst different untrusted governments where you'll be able to exchange assets. We're not there yet. But the idea that these systems can do that is something that everyone's working towards. And yes, it's still part of these government-owned assets, and they still, you don't have the complete immutability and uncensorable assets, but it still sees a benefit out of regulatory protocol that's shared amongst the world. And that's kind of the idea of these financial systems. So secondly, I really wanted to point out on digital identity. I think that's the most important use case for a decentralized system. I think that's the most important thing that we've been fighting for. The separation of money and state is great, but it's your identity that you can really get held up on. People get held up on passports and being able to leave their country all the time. We have corrupt governments, and us creating a better decentralized system for identity is the thing I'm probably most passionate about. And it's going to be a hard thing to get done. Microsoft has been trying for an identification system for years. Facebook's done a great job with their identification system, but coming together and kind of creating a standard to where we can have some base case, some base use of where if your country is corrupt and you have to leave for some odd reason, you can show up somewhere and you have an identity still. You have some sort of access to some sort of credit, and it's not immutable and sensible. You're not going to lose your private key and not have access to it. There's going to be systems where you're going to be able to recover it, but I definitely think that's a system in place that needs to have decentralization.
But like you said, governments have to get together and agree to a standard.
Not for ID.
Yeah.
Not for ID. Yeah, but wait, then the moment you move to assets...
That's what an ID is.
What's ID without the assets?
Self-sovereign identity is what's important to me.
Well, I mean, you can try getting into Liberland with it. That's probably the only place that's going to accept it. And guess what? If the only place people can move to is Liberland with their digital identity that no government approves of, they're not going to have enough room.
You can build skyscraper. Okay, we have no time, but I think everybody realized that we should call our next conference like digital.
This is why we're going to have this discussion next year.
Yeah.
See you at bit 009 for the same discussion in the same room with the same people.
And I think for the startups that are building digital infrastructure currently, now it's like obvious that it's not so easy, not just because like which blockchain to select or whatever, which smart contract language, but how to explain to people what is digital, what are the benefits, and what does it mean?
You start with separating yourself from government money by holding on to as much Bitcoin as you can, and then deal with the rest later when...
Until the rest of the life. Giacomo!
The only one thing that I think wasn't mentioned is just thinking of digital identity from the unbanked perspective.
It's good. Yeah, Web of Trust was exactly like that.
My mind just first goes to the Punjabi farmer in Punjab that does not have a driver's license, does not have a bank account, and he got robbed back to back after conducting his only commerce.
Don't tell your story to everybody.
This is my forefather's story. In No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I was kidding.
Move to Ukraine.
Okay, everyone, hard test. Big round of applause. It's kind of rough to cut off the conference organizer, but whatever.